Today, on Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards. Meredith Wills is a PhD physicist with 20 years of experience in solar astrophysics, who is now applying her research expertise to the field of sports. In her astrophysics career, she specialized in observational analysis, particularly in automated adaptable tracking and detection of complex dynamic events. Her expertise in data science has been particularly effective in utilizing the latest ball and player tracking technology, with a specialization in spatial analysis and visualization. Her passions are baseball and knitting, so let's see how she weaves these interests into another fascinating episode of Stories from Real Life. Here is guest Dr. Meredith Wills with your host, Melvin E. Edwards.
Dr. Wills, I'm very pleased to have you on the show today.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, so my first question is going to require the use of your imagination. So, in your mind, how far do you think you could hit a hanging curveball, especially one with flatter seams?
Me personally, I couldn't hit it at
You
all.
personally,
No, I wouldn't be able to make contact. No way.
not even
No.
in your imagination?
In my oh God. I mean, honestly, even in my imagination, I'm not sure how I'd do. I'd swing and miss.
450. That's
Sure,
what
we'll
I'm
go
gonna
for
say.
that. I mean, with flat seams, let's say anywhere between 380 and 450, which kind of
Okay.
also gets to the point of how baseballs travel. So,
Yes, absolutely. All right, so my first real question here. My son played baseball, and just as he was entering high school, BB core bats became mandatory. And just knowing that BB core stood for bat ball coefficient of restitution made me feel like a physicist. He eventually developed an interest in physics and was recruited to play in baseball and is now a mechanical engineer.
good
So
man.
that's when I had to admit that I was in no way a physicist and had to limit my baseball involvement to being a coach and a fan. So for someone who's an actual physicist like you, can you explain in layman terms what coefficient of restitution means as it relates to the batted ball impact?
Um, well, a phrase that a coach and a ball player would know is it's just the trampoline effect. If you've heard that phrase, so
Hmm.
what the usually coefficient of restitution, bat ball is more related specifically to the essentially the shapes and that things aren't going to hit a square. But you'll hear the acronym COR mostly from, again, the more technical people, I guess. And it really just has to do with how much the ball, always have to have, basically how much the ball squishes against the bat. So if something has a higher COR, it just means that it's going to come off the bat harder because it doesn't squish as much. If you want to get into the physics itself, it means that the essentially the conservation of energy is, or excuse me, conservation of energy is less what's called an elastic collision. So it's losing energy in terms of when it hits because of the deformation. Uh, if something's got a lower COR, it squishes more, and that's a deadened ball, specifically related to, again, that trampoline effect. The analogy I like to use is it's the equivalent of slightly underinflating a basketball. So it just doesn't bounce as well. Its premise is the same.
Okay, that makes
But
sense. All right, so what sparked your initial interest in physics and then eventually astrophysics?
actually, baseball's my dad's side of the family, and science, and particularly physics, is my mom's side. My both of my grandparents actually studied physics, which is pretty cool because my grandma, this would have been World War II era. In fact, she graduated exactly 50 years ahead of me from Radcliffe. My undergrad degree is actually Harvard Radcliffe, which is cool. There was like a 25-year window where you could get the joint degree, or you had to get the joint degree if you're a woman, frankly. But although I'm very proud of it, like just going to Harvard, not nearly as interesting. But they both studied physics. And, grandma in the 40s studying physics was really unusual. She couldn't actually get a job except teaching high school physics. And when they ultimately were out in Nevada, they didn't believe that Harvard, or excuse me, that Radcliffe was an actual accredited institution because it was small enough at the time where her transcript was written by hand. I mean, so just
Whoa.
it says a lot for like how far we've come. But no, Grandpa ultimately got his PhD in physics. Grandma would have, but by then they had 4 kids, and once again, the times she wouldn't have been allowed to be in a program. He worked for NASA in the very, very early days, pre-manned space flight. There were a number of missions, but the one that always we'll go back to is something called Pioneer 5, which was the first flyby of Venus, and actually discovered the solar wind, which was a weird circling back around because ultimately my PhD work related to that. And I hadn't actually made the connection until long after I finished my graduate work. He helped design the first nuclear rocket, which frankly we still haven't used. Probably a good thing. But again, I have pictures of all this stuff. And ultimately, I think he worked at Area 51, which we've never confirmed exactly, but the circumstantial evidence is just lines up a little too well. And he was very clearly involved with top secret aircraft design, like the SR-71. I know he knew about before it was made public. But anyway, so that's the history that I came from on that side. And so, between my grandparents, physics was always interesting. And the idea of physics differentiating from astrophysics was never something. I mean, I remember him explaining what I ultimately now know is general relativity when I was about 7. And I just found it fascinating. It's not actually, again, it's not actually a hard explanation, but it's just so yeah. So I'd always been interested, and it was just I never thought about not studying it in college. But as far as like the actually being an astrophysicist, that was my undergrad and ultimately my graduate degrees. Were it's like I started in college because that's when you start, I guess. So
Okay, very, very fascinating. So, with my son being in a STEM field and not being a lot of minorities
mhm,
at his school when he was there, he graduated
mhm.
4 years ago.
Where did he go?
He went to Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, very,
Oh,
very
awesome.
small school,
Hmm.
but
Yep,
he's doing very, very well.
that's
So
so great.
I sort of developed a fascination or an interest, not really fascination, an interest in seeing more minority students and more girls, more young women in the STEM field. Uh, Obviously, that's something that you were involved in, and your grandmother. So
Mhm.
how do you think we could get more young women and minority students interested in STEM fields and explore their opportunities there?
Wow. That's an interesting question. That actually was something. Part of my graduate work involved. I mean, the PhD was actually solar astrophysics, but I have a master's in physics education research, which actually was a physics degree. In fact, I helped create the degree program at Montana State. And the idea of in this case women, because unfortunately at Montana State we didn't have a lot of minorities, so the on the ground opportunities were fewer. I did have some Native American students, which was fascinating, but that's sort of its own thing because the culture turns out to be very different in a way, again, that's very cool. um, but there's something particularly with women that's referred to as a leaky pipeline that is just, and a lot of it, frankly, seems to be societal. That there's this sort of ingrained idea of what women can or somehow are capable of doing. And then, unfortunately, there are also, I would also argue this is probably societal, that puberty is a real problem. Girls are great at stuff. And then, like, once they start having this idea of what they should be or how they want to impress other girls, boys, whatever. Um, One of the things that I mean, I guess I've never solved this problem personally. There are definitely things that studies that have been done. I have a friend, in fact, who got her master's with this. Was her actually her master's thesis? Was it turns out that in terms of men and women learning together, like in the same kind of situation, it sounds strange, but single sex or at least equally divided for like if you're doing group learning and stuff. And my thesis was also cooperative group learning. That that if you have an imbalance of like a group of four where it's either one woman and three guys or vice versa, the women end up suffering in it. There for whatever reason, if it's
Mm.
just the one woman, she's not taken seriously, even if she's more the voice of expertise. And oddly enough, back to the socialization, if it was three women and one guy, and I saw this in in the classes I taught and did my thesis work on, the women seemed to defer to the guy in a way that
Mm.
I never cared much for. But if you had a 50-50 split, it was fine. Or if you had all of one gender or the other, it seemed fine. Um,
Wow.
Hence societalization there, socialization, that's the word I want. Personally, I have sort of as a fluke, really. I mean, I didn't make an effort. I had a number of incredibly capable students and advisees. You know, it's anything from undergrads up to actual postdoctoral, and they're just research. They're not students anymore; they're researchers. They all ended up being women. I didn't try,
Mm.
but somehow the jobs ended up, or the advising ended up with women who were insanely capable. And you know, I love everything they've done. I take a lot of pride in it. And again, it turned out to be a fluke. Now it's mostly been guys with working with baseball. And I almost, it sounds strange. I almost feel like that was always the way I wanted to make more of an impact. If you're going to have, and this would also fit with minorities, I think, where if it's the advisor, if it's the person who's in charge, who is a woman or who is a minority, that's where you actually want like that kind of situation. I think is going to help more than anything, particularly if you have white cis guys basically. I think that will be a way to you know sort of them just not realizing this isn't the way it normally is, but I wish I had a better answer other than the fact that people are still trying to do it.
Okay, let's talk about now the intersection, your intersection between science and baseball. I know those are two of your passions, two of the three that we plan to talk about today, along with knitting.
Mhm.
So, how did your baseball construction studies reveal, or what did they reveal? And what was the commissioner's response to your conclusions?
Well, the baseball construction studies actually began with the 2017 home run surge. And I don't know how many people remember, first of all, that there was a 2017 home run surge because 2019 eclipsed it so thoroughly. Um, at the time, people didn't know what was causing it. And there was actually, it's hard to find online now, but they MLB put together a home run committee with a lot of people with a lot of basically STEM backgrounds for the most part, lots of PhDs, and they just looked at all of these different potential sources for the home run surge. It's 83 pages, and it's actually worth the read if you can find it. Um, but they didn't just look at the ball. They looked at, bats. They looked at if it was the players. They looked at things like maybe launch angle. Climate change was one that was my favorite on there
Oh,
probably. And ultimately, the only thing they found that, sort of had a statistically significant difference from before the home run surge to 2017 was that the drag on the baseball, which is sort of how quickly it slows down when it's flying through the air, that the drag was lower. So it slows down less quickly. They did not know why it was happening. I wasn't the only one who was sort of looking on my own at, what could be causing it. And there actually is some historical evidence of the construction of the baseball impacting, you know, how it behaves. And in particular, the idea of the interior. Again, this is my that's the cutout
please.
of the inside of a Major League Baseball. But this is all wool in here, like actual, wool. Um, it turns out that, like, for instance, part of the transition, not the whole thing, but part of the transition from the dead ball to the live ball era was right around the end of World War One. And one of the explanations that was given was that they switched from using essentially, cheaper wool, I believe, from the U.S. back to making wool baseballs using Australian merino, and that was something that forever has been sort of widely disparaged. But as a knitter, it does come in. I can attest to the fact that different wool of different qualities really does make a difference. And so it didn't surprise me in the slightest that using better quality merino wool would give you, in this case, a higher coefficient of restitution, hence the ball traveling farther in a live ball era. Like I said, it's not the only thing, but the assumption that changing the wool would have no effect is, again, back to being a scientist, it is far less credible than that it has to have had some effect. So I was looking at the internal construction, and as it turned out, that internal I looked particularly at like 2014 versus 2016-17, and everything on the interior didn't show any real significant difference. On the other hand, I actually looked at the thickness of the laces, the red laces. Back to more show and tell. Generally, when people tear a baseball apart, they actually will, just slice along the seams. Is this just going to be audio as well, just in case?
It'll be audio and video.
Okay, all right. Hi, so for those of you only listening, I am now showing off some actual baseball laces, which, as Melvin can attest, this is a couple very long pieces of string. Generally, when people tear a baseball apart, they will take a razor to the seams because that's the easiest way to take the cover off. I actually bothered to unlace them, and it turns out that the lace thickness for the 2017 ball was thicker than for 2014.
Wow.
Not enough where Rawlings or probably the supplier would have noticed. It turned out to be less than 1/10 of a millimeter, but enough where the measurement was statistically significant. And as it turns out, again, you'll find the knitting pulls, like all of this pulls together. Like the baseball construction couldn't have been done without this knitting and the science and the baseball knowledge. Having thicker laces actually makes it easier for the drag to be lower. I mean, it sounds counterintuitive because people tend to think of lace thickness as the same as the height of the seams, and a ball with higher seams should have more drag. However, the laces are, because they're made of cotton, and balls are air dry when after they're made. You have to dampen the covers because that's the only way you can make them spherical around the ball. But they then air dry the covers, and so it takes like a week, I think, to air dry them. And because the laces are cotton, if you have cotton and you air dry it as opposed to throwing it in the dryer, if you stretch it, it stays stretched. And we've all had the experience of, like, if you say you spill coffee on your t-shirt, you go into the bathroom, you scrub it out, and there's a divot in your shirt for the rest of the day. That's basically what's happening to the laces when you air dry them, and thicker laces aren't going to stretch as much as thinner laces. And as soon as you start stretching, and they'll stay stretched, the one place where the ball has a weak point is basically the seams. So if the ball is going to become less round, hence have more drag, it's going to be because it's bulging at the seams. And as far as I know, I mean, this is something where the actual testing is not something I have access to, but I have yet to hear that being disproved. Again, back to the science. It's a falsifiable theory for that kind of term, which just means the point is it is a disprovable thing. As yet, I don't think it's been tested even. I do have some very preliminary data, very preliminary, because I keep having to take the current baseballs apart, going back at least to 2000, that looks like lace thickness might actually correlate with home run rate. The thicker laces do seem to relate to higher home run rates. And so I've got like hundreds of baseballs from, before Manfred, going back into like the 70s. I think I've even got a couple from the 60s. Eventually I will get to them, but I want to look a lot at the interior, but definitely at the lace thickness because that seems to be something. And then, I mean, I can
Well,
keep going to 2019, 2019 postseason, 2020. It would be so nice if I could stop doing this, but not yet.
so I know you're aware of Tommy Pham's recent comments because I saw it
Tommy
on
Pham
your
is one of the best people in baseball. Yes, yes. He and I have had conversations about this stuff before. He's a
okay, that's
very
what I
good
was going to
human being.
ask. He made
Yep.
some he had some comments recently and during an interview about what he considers
Mm-hmm.
soft baseballs this year, and I wanted to know if you had talked
Yep.
to him about that.
Yeah, he and I he and I have discussed it enough. I mean, it's been remotely. I haven't had a chance to like actually have like a phone call with him yet this season, but yeah, he's you know he let's put it, there are very few players who aren't aware of it or what's going on with the baseballs. It's more that Tommy will talk about it out loud in a way that I think is awesome. You know, there's
Tommy's not
he
shy.
no there's I mean one of my college roommates said this about me at the time, although I think I've become a little better, but it's not it's a good way I think to describe him, which is, you know, we love living with you, Mary. You say the things that we think but would never ever say. And that's, you know, and I appreciate him because he does that, and he's always straight and he has no fear. And that's just an amazing quality. You know, we need more people like that. So
All right, so let's talk about another one of your passions that we just touched on so far was knitting. And
mhm.
you had a direct influence on the baseball construction research. We talked about that. And how did that lead to an an item of yours being in the Baseball Hall of Fame?
Oh man, yeah. And ultimately it even leads to the baseball construction, so it's great throughput. So my mom taught me to knit when I was probably 5. I don't remember. You know, I've always known how to knit, and I will just anybody who's been at you know, at a conference with me or whatever, I will sit and knit through talks and things. I learned this when I was still a student that I pay better attention. I ask better questions if I'm kind of doing that with my hands. It's kind of like doodling, I guess, because I don't have to look. And I mostly will do for smaller projects. I'll do my own designs. I like doing that. So I have a number that are published, and there was a actually they're still around an organization called Stitch and Pitch, which is essentially baseball fans who are also fiber arts people. So it's mostly knitting and crochet, but you'll also see embroidery. In fact, there was a Twins game. This would have been the weekend of, I want to say it was like August 8th, maybe that they did it. No, August 9th. And they hosted that year Stitch and Pitch, and I guess the national anthem was sung by a group while they were knitting. It was the first game of the doubleheader. I need to go back and find that, but so it's still being done. And this would have been in '07, where there was a national competition for, you know, fiber arts designs, original designs, and I created just a sock design that you could insert logos from like 20 something different teams. And in fact, the pattern is still available online. I desperately need to go back and update it, frankly, because a lot of the logos are no longer correct. It's been a long time since '07. But yeah, a couple years later, I was contacted by the Hall of Fame because they wanted to recognize Stitch and Pitch, and the design that I created was actually the national winning design. So for the national contest, and I'd made 2 pairs of socks. One had Yankees logos, the other had Rockies logos, which ended up in '07 being awesome because I was out in Colorado and had season tickets, and so I saw most of the home 21 games in 21 days. It was pretty awesome. Watched postseason stuff and blowing the World Series. Anyway, but the so I donated the Rockies ones because the way that I like to think of it is that if it was Yankees, it would have ended up in the vault very quickly. But with Rockies, there were like a dozen things for the Rockies in the Hall of Fame at the time, and my socks would have been 2 of them. So, you know, easier for them to stay on
That's
display. And in
very
fact,
that's
I
pretty
believe they
cool.
still are on display. Um, but so that led to the original, you know, Hall of Fame display. I got to know one of the senior curators, and he contacted me. I guess it must have been the next year. Maybe it was 20. Yeah, the next year, and they were doing an exhibit called One for the Books, which had all of these like records. Uh, Eddie Goodell, um, his family had lent them his uniform. For those of you who don't remember, Eddie Goodell was the shortest person ever to play. Bill Veeck signed him to like a 1 day contract, and it was a gimmick, but it was a legitimate thing where he came in, it was like 3 feet, and ended up uh, he ended up having one at bat. They obviously walk him on 4 pitches because the strike zone's so small. His number was 1/8, which if that means anything to people, that's a pint, as in pint sized. So it's a great number for that. And but they lent the uniform, but there were no stirrup socks with it. And so I got what I could only describe as a panicked phone call from the senior curator saying, "Listen, we need these socks. Can you do them? The exhibit opens in 3 weeks." And so they sent me one picture that had him in the socks, not a great picture, and then also something of like the Browns logo, St. Louis Browns at the time.
Mhm.
I was able to get a little more information on like what's called a gauge, meaning number of stitches per inch, and I pulled off in 2 weeks some pretty decent socks that were in that display, and that sort of has helped with the relationship with knitting, which then went into round. Then I had started looking at the yarn, already being, and I thought, well, okay, if this is knittable, maybe I can do something with it. And so I actually have done. The idea was to create sort of original pieces out of baseball yarn that the Hall of Fame could then auction off because they are 501c3, and then also provide the patterns for them to sell as sort of also for charitable. And because of that, I was taking a lot of baseballs apart. It turns out that like I have a shawl that I designed that's got a baseball field on it. There's a sweater that's almost done, but then the baseball studies kicked in. And to make a sweater, you have to tear apart like 20 baseballs. So I started getting really good at tearing apart baseballs. And then 2017 came around, and the rest is history. And it means I'm keeping, all of my supplies, partly for the science side, but also because eventually in my old age, I want to get back to doing these patterns for the Hall of Fame and these pieces for the Hall of Fame. So
That's
so
really
there is a
cool.
throughput.
That's really cool. So
Yeah.
in the past, when I've been talking to male football fans, I've said, or when they've asked me about my interest in baseball, I say that football is a man's game, baseball is a thinking man's game. Obviously, very
I
smart
like that.
women also love baseball. So, what do you think it is about baseball that attracts intellectuals like yourself?
Oh man. Well, I mean, to be fair, I came by this honestly, and I was born on opening day. My dad took me to my first game when I was 3 weeks old. Like I've never not been a baseball person, so I'm not sure. You're giving me a lot of credit as like an intellectual. I would have turned any sport that I was born into an intellectual exercise because I can't not do it. Um, but I mean, the pace is very different. I mean, I think that's part of it is that like if you it sort of goes the other way around, not entirely, but I feel like if you in order to be engaged in baseball, the idea of an immediate, fast pace isn't going to appeal to you. You sort of you fill in the pauses, as it were, with an intellectual exercise. I in the same way I don't remember how old I was when my mom taught me to knit. I don't remember my dad teaching me to keep score, but I've been a scorer in some capacity since I was a kid as well. And that's one where I, to be engaged in the game, I have this whole fairly intricate, like scoring sheet that I came up with ages ago that, I will keep track not just pitch by pitch, but I'll actually record, I'll use a multicolor erasable pen, which helps. So I'll keep track of, not just balls and strikes, but what foul balls are. I'll be able to differentiate, different ways people get on base or around the base paths. Like, is it a stolen base? Is it a pass ball? Um, I have like a little place where I can even draw in like the path of the ball that's not on the diamond. And so yeah, so it's not hard to make it an intellectual exercise as a fan in that way. The strategy I do think is very subtle. It can be very different, and in some ways, I'm not pleased with the way that like the DH is cool. The coaching strategy is very different with the DH, though. You hardly ever see pinch hitters anymore. You hardly ever see lineups like getting sort of subtle changes. There's yeah, I mean it's in the same way I guess that football fans will be armchair quarterbacks. I don't think there are any baseball fan, like real baseball fans out there that aren't essentially armchair bench coaches. We all are, because that's just how you watch the game, you know?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So when StatCast came out and fans gained access to things like spin rates, launch angles, estimated distances of struck balls, how excited did that make you?
Um, actually, it, it did. It's a little different path for me, because when I transitioned from astrophysics to baseball, there it was that was also a much more direct path than you think, because part of the reason that it was a possibility at all, I mean, Paul DePodesta from Moneyball was a year ahead of me in college.
Okay.
There was no place for me coming out of college. Not that I wanted to go to grad school, but had I wanted to work for a team, it couldn't have happened. I mean, like, in the same way that my grandma would never have been accepted for a PhD program, I cannot imagine a female astrophysicist being hired in a front office. No, that just would not, even with the Moneyball thing starting to come on, that was a very, that was an Excel spreadsheet, very simple kind of thing. And you just wouldn't, scientists weren't doing that. And frankly, women weren't doing that, both front offices in some kind of a analytics capacity. So as it turns out, what I did for solar astrophysics was very much, the sun is much more interesting in my mind than most other stuff, because it's dynamic. It's like you're basically looking at videos, and there's real science data in them. The way we take the data is like, it's not just bright, like there's a photon count for each little level of brightness. You can sort of pull the science from it. But as I'm looking at movies, I've always been a defense geek. And so I found out before StatCast existed that they were going to be doing player tracking. And as soon as that was the motivation for jumping into baseball, because, one, look, defense, I can do player tracking. But also, what I did in Astro was way more complicated than looking at potentially 13 players on a ball field when they're all discrete and nothing's like, it's a much easier, like, sort of analysis issue than what I had done in astrophysics. So early on, I was like literally creating pseudo data or developing solutions to or I shouldn't say solutions, but coming up with metrics and ways to understand fielding in anticipation of what became StatCast.
Wow.
What I now do professionally, like, what I don't get paid to do the baseball research, like the actual baseball construction research, but my real job, as it were, now literally deals with ball and player tracking. And in fact, the technology is, if people know the term pitch FX, this was the pitch FX technology became field FX, which was actually the original StatCast. So like the very first rendition of StatCast was the tech that I am now working with. So it's so I was definitely excited about it, but not as a fan. I was literally, oh look, here's this professional opportunity. I think before, and I was a couple of years ahead. So it took some
Wow.
patience, and it was an interesting journey, but it was a
That's
neat
really
experience.
fascinating.
Yeah.
So what's the most satisfying part of that part of your career for you?
Actually, the most satisfying part is what I am doing right this minute. And by right this minute, I mean like literally what things have just wrapped up for the current iteration over the weekend. And one of the things that we've done, that same technology, we've taken, it used to be only in professional baseball. We've now taken it and we're installing that exact same ball and player tracking tech in colleges. So, so there are data that we'll license it to teams for the draft, but it means that they now have fielding data so that they can actually draft college players based on that. But when we came up with the program, those of us who sort of designed the thing insisted that we had to have an academic component, because if we're going to go into colleges, college is for education. And so we've since had the opportunity to we're now, I mean, there's a number of parts to it, but the one that's kind of become the flagship is something that we call the SMT Data Challenge, and it's just wrapped up for its third year, where students are able to go in, work with these data, with ball and player tracking data from actual pro ball, minor league ball, and do the kind of analysis projects that nobody would get to do as a student. And I'm able to take, that I did that physics education research master's. I love working with students. I love the opportunities. I love all of the advisees I had. I now get to do that with baseball data with really enthusiastic, bright students who have. I'm not going to go into some of the projects because there is judging going on right this minute already. Things will be announced in October, at which point we can kind of start showing off. But oh my God, there are so many brilliant, talented kids. And it's not just like they're smart, they're good at working with data, but they're also just smart baseball people. Oh man. They're just, it's an intense process for like the 2 months that it's going on, but I wouldn't be doing anything else that way. And we talk about the most fulfilling part, far and away. I am privileged to get to do that, and I've gotten to do it for 3 years running, and we're expanding all things, and it's huge.
Well,
So,
yeah, you obviously are excited about that because your face just lighting up while you're talking about those
yeah.
projects. So, what are
So
some of the, aside
actually,
from
I was
baseball
going to
and
say back to your original question, though. One of the things we're going to be doing, sort of upcoming for the 2024 semester, because we also can do this with colleges, we're doing a more targeted, what we're calling a data derby at schools through what's called cooperating Raleigh colleges, and there's a women's college. There are 2 HBCUs, and so we're like very specific. They're all small schools. Okay, there's NC State, and then there's a community college, Wake Tech. I'm really excited about that because those are kids who would never consider that they would be capable of doing this. And so, that's back to the trying to create opportunities specifically within those groups. And I should point out that the kids who are doing this are getting hired by teams. So it's not just like a thought experiment. Literally, we have teams who are seeking these kids out to hire them. We've had like a dozen hired, I want to say, from the first 2 competitions. I think it's going to be even better this year.
wow,
So it's a big
okay,
deal.
that
Yeah.
that is a big deal. That's really cool.
Yeah.
I'm excited
In
to
other
hear
words,
that.
if you're a student and you're listening to this, all you have to be is over 18 and registered for the fall semester afterwards. Keep an eye out for 2025 because we're going to be doing it again. You know, registration is
That's
going to be
pretty
like in
cool.
March or April. Please, please. I love doing this. So, yeah.
That sounds like fun. So, aside from baseball and knitting and science physics competitions, what are some other things that animate you?
Oh, God. Isn't that enough?
That is enough.
I was going to say, I'm not sure I have time for much else, actually. If anything, I'm a little behind on some of my stuff because, like I got to catch up on tearing apart baseballs, for instance, because the data challenge keeps growing. Um, God, I don't know. Yeah, that's a loaded question. I was going to say,
Okay, yeah, we'll just
my
leave it
cats
there.
make me crazy. I'm surprised they haven't wandered through the interview. But
You're being respectful. I
yeah,
appreciate that.
that's mostly it, I think. You
Okay,
know.
so the last question I've got for you today is: what are some things you're working on now, and what are you? Or do you have any plans to write any books?
Oh God. Actually, me personally, no, mostly because the last thing I need is another project. I have been the last couple articles on the baseball. Bradford Davis has actually written the articles after the first couple things, because I did do a few articles for The Athletic, which were specifically construction. Once things started getting weird in 2020, where it was no longer strictly science. There was more investigative journalism involved. I've been doing the science while other people have actually been doing the investigative journalism. And so Bradford Davis is the one who's done that. And I'm counting on him to write a book about the baseballs themselves. I don't think, that's the interesting topic. If someone wants to go into the backstory, that's fine. It wouldn't surprise me if this became a Michael Lewis book once the baseball things finally get figured out. It's kind of got that vibe. I mean, sometimes I feel like my life is being a character in a Michael Lewis book. So, we're already primed. I'm not the only one either. There's a couple of us running around. Tommy could be in it. He'd be great.
That sounds like an idea. Maybe we can pitch this to a studio or something, make a movie out of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just anyway. My brother's been claiming for years that Scarlett Johansson should play me. I'm not really sure I buy it, but he seems to think it's reasonable. So.
Sure. Can she hit a baseball 450? If not, we're gonna have to find somebody
probably better than I could, which isn't saying much. So yeah.
We'll see. We'll have an open audition.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it for my questions. And so my guest this week has been Dr. Meredith Wills. Meredith, thank you for taking the time to be here and sharing your stories. It has been a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So that's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.